Hello. Can you hear me if I talk at this level? Can you hear me? No? Yes? Maybe? I'm just going to play the music like gently in the background because it's not important what I have to say, although I am thanking people, so that is important. But we're going to be listening for a few minutes just in the background to the Chevalier de Saint-Georges a little bit. You're going to hear a little bit more about him when Christy Pichichero comes up and does her talk, but we thought it would be good for those in the audience to hear a little bit of his music as we're gathering here. This evening, thank you for coming. That's the first people I always thank are the people in the room and the people out there in YouTube land who are listening to this or watching this on live stream right now, because the PBK folks are playing this across the great land of ours and internationally, I suppose. I have to say thank you to the people who helped fund this this evening. That includes, of course, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences under the leadership of Dean Shelton, the English department, Angela Vietto, the Phi Beta Kappa Association of Eastern Illinois. This is, after all, the annual Phi Beta Kappa lecture, which you'll hear a little bit more about from the president of the association, Susie Park, who'll be up here in a second. I would also like to thank Christina Eitbibi of the World Languages Department, and Stacey Elder, who is also here. Yep, there you are. Stacey Elder from History Department, who helped fund this as well. And the biggest thanks, I think, has to go to a person who has done an extremely good job of creating a series of events all through this semester for commemorating, to make a statement about Eastern's commitment to remembering the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, to remember the atrocities that began 400 years ago and a lot of the things that have occurred since, and we've had some great discussions over the last few months. So let's all give a good big round of applause to David Camerling Smith, who is responsible for all this. Apparently, if I open my mouth and don't say anything, there's feedback. So I guess that's good to know for my future self. After this event tonight, there'll be a reception at the home of Susie Park and myself, C.C. Warham. I am the director of the Humanities Center here at EIU. You're all welcome to come. The address is unknown to you now, but it will be 1102 Monroe Avenue. We'll remind you of that afterwards. There'll be a Q&A afterwards, at which time I'll be bringing this microphone around, because, as I stated earlier, this is being heard across the YouTubes. And unless you speak into this microphone, unless I speak into this microphone, they won't hear you out there, even if people in this place here will hear you. So I'll be bringing that around for you to ask questions. I would like, of course, for Susie Park to come up and welcome and introduce our esteemed guest for this evening. Thank you for coming. Come on, Susie.
Welcome to the 29th Annual Phi Beta Kappa Fall Lecture. My name is Susie Park. I have the great pleasure of serving as a Phi Beta Kappa National Senator and the President of the Phi Beta Kappa Alumni Association of Central Illinois, housed here at Eastern Illinois University. I thank the EIU Humanities Center, Department of English, Department of History, Department of World Languages and Cultures, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the PBK members who have donated so generously every year to PBK events. At the national and the local level, you're turning that off. Phi Beta Kappa, the nation's premier and very first honor society, is doing amazing things in its advocacy for the value and pure love of learning, and particularly the value of learning in the liberal arts and sciences. Broaden the mind, challenge yourself and others to be excellent, seek friendship, all in the service of humanity. Dr. Christy Pichichero is Associate Professor of French and History at George Mason University, with a bachelor's in Comp Lit from Princeton, a bachelor's of Music and Opera Singing from the Eastman School of Music, and a PhD in French from Stanford. She has held multiple fellowships at the Stanford Humanities Center, Cambridge University, the École Normale Supérieure, and West Point Military Academy. Her first book, The Military Enlightenment, War and Culture in the French Empire from Louis XIV to Napoleon, Cornell University Press, was a finalist for the Oscar Kensher Book Prize for Best Interdisciplinary Book in 18th Century Studies. The book does it all, as they say, in bridging literature with art, with moral philosophy, with the earliest writings on war. It does not shy away from investigating how much time and energy people have spent thinking about how to wage war efficiently, effectively, and yet humanely. Along with being a much sought-after scholar of the history of emotions, critical race studies, and multiculturalism, because French history and opera wouldn't be enough, Dr. Pichichero has more than 20 years of experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and has held multiple leadership positions. She is the vice president of the Western Society for French History, the board of directors of the Consortium on the Revolutionary Era, and the Presidential Advisory Committee of the American Society for 18th Century Studies. Her current research, which she will talk about today, brings together critical mixed race studies and archival research to examine intersectionality, privilege, and racialization in early modern Europe. The Creating Inclusive Spaces at EIU workshop that many participants, some of them here, enjoyed today brought a treasure trove of knowledge and pedagogical interaction. But if you were to examine the earliest stages of my correspondence with Dr. Christy Pichichero, you would never have gambled on such a positive experience. Let me explain. After Dr. Pichichero graciously accepted my invitation to serve as our Phi Beta Kappa Fall lecturer, after having met her in DC through our wonderful mutual friend, Catherine Martell, I knew this was the right opportunity to be upfront with her about a few matters, but in a cheerful, non-threatening way. It was also high time to update my non-prima donna ironclad contract with every speaker I host, and every speaker must sign in return. Because I think this kind of delicate matter could be instructive for us all. Here's what I wrote in one letter, word for word. Dear Dr. Pichichero, or Christy, if I may, we are extremely excited that you will be visiting EIU's campus. A scholar of your stature can offer our students a rich learning experience indeed. When you so happily agreed to deliver the PBK lecture, and perhaps another event or two, I was overjoyed. Yet this also put me in mind of a few more things that I want, nay, need to bring to your attention. Regarding the particulars of your trip to Charleston, I feel it is important to prepare you for a few contingencies that you might at first find slightly odd, but believe me, this takes away nothing from the incontrovertible fact that you are still a most revered and appreciated world-class scholar. While I'm grateful for the co-sponsorship of several departments on campus, we all know too well that every dollar needs to go as far as possible these days. Times are tough, and so I expect that you will not be too surprised by the advice I'm about to give. First, your arrival into St. Louis on Sunday poses something of an issue. Knowing that you are a hale and hearty walker, a former soccer captain, am I right? And expecting that central Illinois weather is particularly beautiful at this time of year, I recommend that you pack lightly and take your time making the stroll or taking Uber to Charleston. Really, don't we all need more exercise? And how often do we literally stop to smell the roses or anything? This is your chance. Second, instead of staying at a traditional impersonal hotel, why not take advantage of that beautiful fall weather? I have a one-person tent and a large yard, so you would be spoiled for choices of spots for camping under the stars. Third, did I hear correctly that your lovely husband, Tom, makes a wicked good sandwich? Since you like to eat healthy foods, and since we will be so busy with different events, please ask him to pack at least 10 of these for you, minus any mayonnaise and meat, as they would undoubtedly spoil. That should cover it for now. I'll let you know if any other contingencies arise. Please understand that I am not cutting corners or trimming the fat, as they say, but rather inviting you to explore with me some creative options that could be so much more rewarding because so much harder won and therefore memorable. As you will see, the possibilities for enjoying a truly unique experience in Charleston are endless. We can't wait to host you here at EIU. Best, Susie. Dr. Pichichero is quite simply amazing, and I invite you to please give her your warmest welcome. Thank you.
No, I just stole them from the workshop today. I'm still a student at heart. Okay, and I work in a public university, so I don't make a lot of money. Okay, thank you so much for these warm welcomes from both Charles and from Susie, and thank you all for being here today. I have had the chance to visit your campus and to meet some really fabulous people over the past 2 days, including your president. And I just want to thank you for showing me your university, for teaching me about the wonderful things that are going on here, and for allowing me this chance to contribute to your community and to your 1619 project in these multiple ways, through both the workshop earlier and now through this talk. So let me make sure that we are good with the sound. Before I get started. It turned off? Okay, now it's definitely off. All right. Yes, thank you. Okay, back in business. So, Black Power, Race, and Privilege in Early Modern France. July 19th, 1777. The theater-going public in Paris and in the royal court at Versailles are buzzing with excitement. At the Comédie Italienne, oops, I need to move this. At the Comédie Italienne, a new comic opera called Ernestine is debuting. It is based upon the wildly popular novel of the same name, penned by Madame Riccoboni, and first published in 1765. The libretto for the opera has been written by a relatively unknown author, Chauderlot de Laclos, who is an artillery captain stationed in a quiet provincial outpost. This Laclos is not the source of the enthusiasm and curiosity, however. It is the composer who created the score of the opera, the famed Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Not only is he known to be the finest fencer in France, but he is also one of the era's most virtuosic violinists, who is both music director and first violin at the Concert des Amateurs Orchestra, one of the premier orchestral ensembles in all of Europe. He has written a number of concertos for violin and orchestra, and has been celebrated near and far for his beautiful compositions, his incredible expressiveness as a violinist, and his unparalleled bow techniques. But the Chevalier de Saint-Georges has never composed an opera score, so this is an exciting foray into unknown territory. The debut is nothing less than a royal gala affair, as Queen Marie-Antoinette and her sisters-in-law, the Countesses de Provence and d'Artois, make their way from the Gilded Palace at Versailles to the theater in the Hôtel de Bourgogne on the Rue Mauconseil, now the Rue Étienne Marcel, in the 2nd arrondissement of Paris. The Grand Theater holds up to 1,500 people, with room for 600 spectators in the parterre, or orchestra section, and 900 seats on the stage, as well as in 3 tiers of loges, with private boxes and balcony seats, the highest of which is referred to as Le Paradis, or paradise. After a short and raucous comedic opener in the Italian Commedia dell'arte style, the theater grows silent as the first sublime notes of Saint-Georges' score ring through the air. Even in the nosebleed seats, it is indeed paradise. Or not. While the overture and first musical number are greeted with praise and applause, very quickly the ambiance changes as the audience starts to boo and sneer loudly. They are reacting to Laclos' clumsy poetic writing and the liberties he has taken with the plotline and characters of Riccoboni's beloved novel. The insufficient rehearsal time of the orchestra and cast are beginning to show, and opera diva Mademoiselle Dugazon, who is playing one of the lead female roles, is getting increasingly tipsy as she takes sips of alcohol from a bottle that her valet is holding for her on the side of the stage. All of a sudden, everything starts falling apart. Friedrich Melchior Baron von Grimm, German-born opera expert and journalist of art criticism, wrote in his Correspondance littéraire that, I quote, "One could hardly have chosen a more agreeable subject. One could hardly have disfigured it to a more unpleasant degree," end quote. Another commented that, I quote, "The poet had the art to render detestable a subject so agreeable and touching in the original story. Nothing could fall more flat." Now, Saint-Georges received many compliments on the music, but he was not spared the vitriol in the critiques that flowed forth in the following days. Saint-Georges may be known as a distinguished composer of concertos and a dazzling violinist, but, one commentator remarked, he does not have the same good taste in matters concerning dramatic works, and should have sensed that an excellent musical score adapting a flat and detestable comic opera loses all of its value, end quote. Playwright and literary critic Jean-François de la Harpe hyperbolically panned the entire work, saying that Ernestine tanked at the Italian comedy in the most ridiculous way in the world. It tanked never to be revived. Words and music, everything was booed from beginning to end. And he goes on, "What is funny is that it was the Queen who had protected the piece who mocked it more than anyone. Noting, nothing put the audience in the parterre in a better mood than the character of a messenger," and this is a character that Laclos made up, invented for the story, "who came to announce the denouement of the plot and who was cracking his whip and crying out crudely, 'Ohé, ohé!' Immediately, the parterre started yelling, 'Ohé!' And then the Queen, descending the staircase as she left, also yelled, 'Ohé!' As she climbed into her carriage, she called out to her coachman, 'To Versailles, ohé!' As historian and musicologist Gabriel Bana sums up in his book on this utterly humiliating episode, needless to say, there was no second performance. And as we would say in our contemporary colloquial parlance, fail. Huge fail. Yet this failure is not what it seems. First, to my knowledge, Ernestine was the first opera composed by a French man of color in the country's history. This alone deserves applause. What is more, Saint-Georges' very public debuting of this opera flew in the face of the increasingly hostile legal and cultural environment in France toward individuals of African descent. For centuries, France and its courts had upheld the freedom principle, the idea that any enslaved person who set foot on French soil automatically became free. Yet, as historian Sue Peabody explained in her landmark study on the subject, by the 1780s, France's Caribbean colonies produced more than 2/5 of the Western world's sugar and coffee, and the French government was increasingly dependent on colonial commerce as a source of revenue. The tension between France's economic dependence on colonial slavery and its celebration of liberty became explosive, as the country, which had been host to very few inhabitants of African descent, saw increasing numbers over the 18th century. Plantation owners brought the majority of these individuals to France as enslaved servants who assisted them on the transatlantic voyage and subsequently in their households in the metropole, just as they had done in colonial settings. Sue Peabody's work has brought to light the numerous cases of enslaved people who sued for their freedom and who won it in France, particularly in the jurisdiction of the Parlement of Paris. Other people, though, like Saint-Georges, were the illegitimate offspring of white French colonists and usually women of African origins, mostly enslaved, as was Saint-Georges' mother, though some were free. These children accompanied their fathers or were sent to France to receive an elite education. Saint-Georges and those like him benefited from considerable privilege, though their legal status, their Frenchness, family belonging and inheritance, and position in French society were highly ambiguous and precarious. Here we must recall that a child born to an enslaved woman was also legally enslaved, ensuring that the investment in a female enslaved woman would yield more labor power. In 1777, the year that Ernestine was premiered and flopped, the lives of people of color in France were besieged by the most stringent and threatening set of laws to date, the infamous Police des Noirs. If the Code Noir, or Black Code, of 1685 delineated laws surrounding the treatment of enslaved people and the behavior of their masters in overseas colonies, a separate set of ordinances were issued to create parameters for controlling the lives of enslaved people in metropolitan France. 4 ordinances, increasingly strict, were passed, culminating in the Police des Noirs of 1777. The first royal edict of 1716 had permitted colonial property owners and military officers to bring enslaved people to France, supposedly temporarily, to receive instruction in the Catholic faith or to learn a trade. The only stipulation was that those wishing to bring enslaved men and women to the metropole had to acquire the permission of their colonial governor before departing, and then register the enslaved individuals with admiralty clerks upon arrival in France. Failing to go through this administrative process was grounds for the freedom of these enslaved people. An edict of 1738 tightened restrictions, mandating that enslaved individuals from the colonies could only stay in France for 3 years, and that any enslaved person in violation of administrative and temporal regulations would be confiscated by the crown and sent back to the colonies. As the century continued and increasing numbers of people of color, enslaved and free, entered the metropole and did not depart, the crown moved to monitor and restrain these individuals in ever more insidious ways. In 1762, the Admiralty passed an ordinance that racialized these people in order to better police them. Instead of focusing on their legal status in relation to slavery, the new ordinance required that all people with African parentage, full or mixed, register themselves with the Admiralty and indicate their status of free or enslaved. The language of this ordinance was racial and referred to terms that we no longer use and that many find offensive, those of Negroes and mulattoes. Yet despite efforts to control a larger group of people by targeting race, the effectiveness of this ordinance was hampered as it was de facto voluntary, since no means of enforcing it or punitive measures for noncompliance were put into place. Rising racism, fears of miscegenation, and anxieties about the erosion of traditional social order, however, led to the terrible watershed legislation of the Police des Noirs that was issued on August 9th, 1777, just 3 weeks after the debut of Saint-Georges and La Close Opéra Ernestine. This law forewent the terms of the 1762 ordinance to cast the widest net possible, targeting phenotype. All noir, all black and brown people collapsed together, regardless of origin. The law prohibited any further noir from entering France. It set up detention facilities at ports in order to arrest and send these individuals back to the colonies. All noirs already in France were also to register themselves, surely conjuring the possibility of deportation and the specter of enslavement or re-enslavement for many of these people. While the Police des Noirs encountered difficulties from the moment it was put into place, it was nevertheless the most thorough, most broadly racialized and racist, and most menacing piece of legislation that had passed in France to date. Yet somehow, Saint-Georges found a path forward, evading the 1777 register, continuing as the first violin and music master at the Concert des Amateurs, maintaining his life as a public figure, and even trying his hand again at composing operatic music. He seems to have been undeterred, and we are left with the questions of how and why. As we embark upon this query, we must never lose track of the millions of people who were ripped from the African continent, who endured or perished during the transatlantic voyage, and whose survivors faced a life of servitude and worse in the legal status of movable property within the system of chattel slavery. And these are some statistics by European nation, all collected at Emory University. And we must remember that individuals like Saint-Georges are never far from this segment of the early modern population. After all, his own mother had been enslaved, and his legal status at birth would have been the same before his father manumitted them both. Thankfully and rightfully, studies are being pursued all over the world in order to recover the experiences of enslaved people, to return them a humanity that was conveniently ignored in the name of production. Researchers are shedding light on the ways that these people pursued their freedom, from military enlistment, loyal household service, lawsuits, and of course, violent revolution. But my interest today is to open an inquiry into another segment of this population, people of African descent who found themselves on the other end of the spectrum, close to power and close to privilege. One may legitimately ask, why study people like Saint-Georges? Was he not a statistical outlier, one of the privileged few compared to the millions of enslaved individuals? I believe that there are many reasons to pursue such study. As a scholar and a teacher, I'm responding to the demands of my Black students, who ask me why, along with studies of chattel slavery and the heroes of the Haitian Revolution, like Toussaint Louverture. Oh, this is a terrible picture from Candide. C'est à ce prix que vous mangez du sucre en Europe. This is the price of your eating, of your having sugar in Europe, and this enslaved has been tortured and maimed. But this is Toussaint Louverture, who ended that on the island in the country of Haiti. We do not study stories of other individuals whose lives and achievements contribute to and nuance our vision of Black diasporic history and pride. So this is a complaint that my students lodged with me, and in many ways motivated me to start thinking in a more nuanced way about the many people and many experiences in this story. We can bring dignity to our ancestors whose labors built the great powers of today. We can celebrate the heroes that fought for abolition or laid down their lives to end slavery. And we can also learn from those who took a kind of middle path, who resisted in varying ways and pursued their lives in the best way that they could within ever-evolving circumstances. Indeed, resistance takes many forms, and I want to help us develop a deeper understanding of forms of resistance in my area of academic specialization, which is 18th century France. To find these people and to tell their stories, we have to be creative in the places we look, the questions we ask, and the conceptual frameworks that we use. We must challenge our assumptions and consider different modes of empowerment in varied sectors of Black experience. Like historians of the early modern French Atlantic world, such as Sue Peabody, Jennifer Palmer, Paul Cheney, and others, I find value in a method that combines a microhistorical examination of the lives of individuals with the macrohistorical phenomena that molded their lives. So today, using Saint-Georges as a test case, I want to interrogate the concepts and intersections of Black power and privilege with the goal of bringing into relief both lived experiences and the structures of racial politics at the dawn of their inception in France. I will proceed by relaying some details to you about Saint-Georges' life, with an emphasis on the period prior to the French Revolution of 1789. I will then launch into our investigation, pursuing an apophatic analysis in which I will try to move us closer to understanding racial realities of Saint-Georges' life and era by arguing against certain theoretical and conceptual frameworks. So here I'm taking the via negativa approach, a kind of process of elimination that moves us toward something that I think is more viable. Replacing, therefore, these lenses of interpretation, I will propose to think through concepts from critical race theory to uncover the complex dynamics surrounding race, power, and privilege. And I will end with a few concluding remarks about different historical understandings of Black power and what they can teach us about racial politics in 18th century France, as well as in our world today. Saint-Georges did not leave us with any memoirs or correspondence outside of military documentation. He has nevertheless been the subject of several biographies that, often with some speculation, have tried to breathe life into the incredible twists, turns, and lacuna that mark his story. Gabrielle Banat's book of 2006 is 466 pages plus documents, so suffice it to say that I can only give the most rudimentary sketch of his life here today. Joseph Bologne de Saint-Georges was born in 1745 in Baillif, Basse-Terre, on the island of Guadeloupe. He was the son of an enslaved woman, Anne or Nanon, and white middle-class planter Georges Boulogne, who himself was married to a white Creole woman named Elisabeth Méricain, and with whom he had one legitimate daughter. Having grown wealthy due to his plantations in Guadeloupe, Georges Boulogne was able to send Joseph to France for an elite education as a young child, and he was able to purchase a noble title for himself as gentilhomme ordinaire de la Chambre du Roi, gentleman of the king's chamber, so someone who had access to the king and to the highest, most powerful people at Versailles. Shortly thereafter, Georges secured a spot for Joseph at the fencing academy of Nicolas Textier de la Bossière in Paris, where Joseph's astounding athletic talents quickly gained attention. At 15, wrote La Bossière's son, his progress was so rapid that he was already beating the best swordsmen, and at 17, he developed the greatest speed imaginable. As his reputation grew, so did professional challenges and jealousy, onto which were juxtaposed the ever more palpable tensions surrounding race. One of his first and most famous challenges came when he was still a student, when Alexandre Picard, a fencing master in Rouen, insulted Joseph, calling him an European parentage, but also conveyed a multi-layered derogatory connotation, since it relates to the mule, the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse that is considered a beast of burden and is reproductively sterile. This is why we don't use this term today. With his father's and his fencing master's encouragement, and with lots of public attention and betting on either side, including allegedly bets that were placed by the king himself, a 14-year-old Joseph traveled to Rouen to prove himself in a fencing match against Picard. There were reported to have been hundreds of spectators at the match, at which Joseph roundly defeated Picard with remarkable ease. His style and positioning were written about in fencing treatises of the era, and this famed victory against Picard was of symbolic significance for Joseph individually, for his fencing master, for his father, and for the racial stakes that Picard himself had laid. Shortly thereafter, Joseph became one of the gendarmes de la garde du roi, a military unit providing security to the king at Versailles. And from then on, Joseph would be called the Chevalier or Knight de Saint-Georges. A young celebrity with a prestigious military position at Versailles and a handsome annuity offered to him by his father, Saint-Georges soon became the darling of elite circles at the royal court and in Paris. Like many privileged children, alongside fencing, Saint-Georges had been taking violin and musical composition lessons as a part of his education. Unbelievably, his skill with a bow paralleled his skill with the sword, and it is likely that as a child, little Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart may have heard Saint-Georges play during a concert tour that brought him to Paris. Violinist, composer, and musical director François-Joseph Gossec dedicated a violin trio to Saint-Georges in 1766, and in 1769, Gossec invited Saint-Georges to play in the Concert des Amateurs, orchestral ensemble that he conducted. By then, Saint-Georges was referred to as l'inimitable, or the inimitable. And by mid-1773, he had composed his first 6 string quartets, then went on to write concertos, symphonie concertante, and as we know, opera scores. Sometime around that year, Saint-Georges made his triple debut at the Concert des Amateurs as first violin, composer, and then conductor, as Gossec left to direct another orchestra. At 28 years old, a mere 28 years old, Saint-Georges was living a dream. Following that year, however, that dream began to tear at the seams. In 1773, his father, Georges, left for Guadeloupe, and in 1774, he died there, leaving his plantations, properties, investments, and savings to his legitimate daughter. Scholars have shown that the transfer of wealth toward legitimate children was common during the 18th century, and this was certainly the case for many colonial families in which the illegitimate children were often racially mixed. Despite this devastating turn in his fortune, Saint-Georges persisted, continuing in his central role in the Parisian music scene and maintaining his military position at Versailles, where he had become friends with many powerful people, including the newly crowned Queen Marie-Antoinette, who was a supporter of his music and his person. In early 1776, the management of the Académie Royale de Musique, or Paris Opera, was up for auction, and Saint-Georges' success in rendering the Concert des Amateurs one of the most important orchestras in Europe made him a top contender for that position. Grimm reported on the crushing event that followed, relaying that, I quote, "No sooner were the opera singers, Mesdemoiselles Arnoux, Guimard, Rosalie, and others, informed of the news that Saint-Georges had been proposed as music director of the opera, they presented a plaquet, or a petition, to the Queen, assuring Her Majesty that their honor and their delicate conscience could never allow them to submit to the orders of a mulatto. Such an important consideration, Grimm says, makes all the impression it is expected to make," end quote. Suddenly, Saint-Georges' racial status was called to attention in a most public fashion, just as it had been in his match with Picard. Only this time, there was no forum to prove his worth, which in any case was likely recognized by all those who knew him. And although actresses and singers were not held in high regard on the social ladder, nor were women anywhere near as powerful as men in patriarchal French society, this racializing moment revealed a somewhat shocking hierarchy in identity and relations. The demands of white women of common background, who were often themselves treated as prostitutes, took precedence over the merit of an elite man of color. As we know, the following summer marked another height of precarity for Saint-Georges, as his first opera, Ernestine, was a total flop, and the Police des Noirs hardened racial distinctions as never before. Saint-Georges again persisted, and the elite crowd in which he operated continued to appreciate his talents. Madame de Montesson, who was the secret wife of royal prince Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, proposed to bring Saint-Georges into their household as both the music director of their theater and the lieutenant of the prince's hunting ground at Rancy. Saint-Georges took residence at their home on the Chaussée d'Antin in Paris and remained in the family entourage for many years thereafter. These years continued to be marked by extraordinary events in his private and public life. A passionate love affair with the wife of the Général de Montalembert, in whose theater he also served as a conductor. This affair may have led to the birth of a son that died in infancy, and certainly led to an assassination attempt of Saint-Georges by hitmen who were hired by the cuckolded husband. There was a departure for England with the d'Orléans family during the early French Revolution, and a fencing match with the Chevalier d'Eon, who some of you may know was a man who started dressing as a woman and was also a fencing master. Wonderful histories have been written about this individual. Later, there was a return to France, a commission in the National Guard during the French Revolution, and then a position as commander of the Légion des Américains, or the Légion de Saint-Georges, the first all-black unit in the French army. There was a false accusation of treason and an arrest in 1793, followed by release from prison and redemption, though not sufficient enough to allow him to return to his unit. The abolition of slavery occurred in 1794. Saint-Georges' life ended in June 1799, the same year that the French Revolution ended. Sources report him to have died in the same miserable state as Mozart, who he had inspired, poor, sick, and alone. Ironically, Mozart became a household name. Saint-Georges, not so much. This sketch of Saint-Georges' life lays the foundation for probing into questions of race, power, and privilege in 18th century France. And here is where we are going to my analysis. In terms of theoretical framing, scholarly studies have focused on the radical, philosophical, and political tenets of what literary scholar Nick Nesbitt calls Caribbean critique. Distinguishing between what Marx dismissed as mere criticism and the more powerful radical critique, Nesbitt points to a document by leaders of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, Jean-François, and Georges Biassou. In this document, they proposed an alternative ideological structuration of social reality, and they refused all of the compromising formations of the so-called Friends of the Blacks, who imagined utopian schemes to ameliorate the plantation system. While the other two members of this three-part collective would quickly disappear from the scene of struggle, Toussaint Louverture founded a tradition of Caribbean critique beyond any mere criticism. For the next decade, until his capture and death, Louverture refused the false promise of ideological enlightenment. His actions illustrate his steadfast insistence that it is not sufficient simply to grasp the truth in the face of an injustice like plantation slavery. Rather, as Louverture's actions reveal, the subject of the truth, in this case of universal emancipation, must force reality to conform to the idea. And these are the words of Nick Nesbitt. As this definition of the founding moment of Caribbean critique makes clear, Saint-Georges was far from this radical mode of thought and action. While he became an abolitionist, it would seem, we have no evidence that he bought into or rejected the so-called false promise of ideological enlightenment concerning race and chattel slavery, and he was no longer alive when Haiti declared its independence in 1804. We also cannot say that Saint-Georges' actions conformed to the universal vision of equality. If, as Nesbitt writes, the universal concepts, right, freedom, equality, justice, are formulated by enslaved Caribbean subjects in a way that would have been unavailable or unimaginable for the white French subjects of 1789, we must also wonder whether these universal concepts were imaginable for Saint-Georges. Perhaps they were, but even so, they never led him into the revolutionary fray in the mode of Louverture, who fought, literally fought, for the dismantling of chattel slavery and white supremacy. Equally unfit for theorizing Saint-Georges' philosophical and political stance are the notions of créolité, Creoleness, and Antillanité, Caribbeanness. Rejecting the monolithic view of Blackness that characterized the Négritude movement of the 1930s, Édouard Glissant and others, writing in the 1960s and thereafter, insisted that an authentic view of Caribbean identity had to comprise the simultaneous existence of many histories and identities: enslaved and free individuals, indigenous peoples, European colonists, and other migrants, including from South and East Asia. Créolité rejects the universal, the monolingual, and the notion of purity in order to celebrate the rich heterogeny of Creole identities and languages. A cursory look at Saint-Georges' life and identity might lead us to think that this theoretical approach is appropriate for interpreting his experiences. He was, after all, the son of a Black enslaved mother and a white French father, and he lived in Guadeloupe for just about the first 7 years of his life. What is more, his mother lived in Paris for part of his childhood and adult life, perhaps bringing him continued cultural input that he interwove into his worldview and life among white elites in Paris, thereby constructing a consciously mixed notion of his identity reflective of créolité. Yet, we have absolutely no indication that his childhood in Guadeloupe or his continued contact with his mother had this effect on his self-construction. Rather, it seems to me that we scholars want to associate créolité with Saint-Georges, honoring the multiple parts of his heritage, and also interpreting his identity in theoretical terms that, from afar, seem plausible. I think we must be wary of these somewhat facile categorizations, especially when there is a lack of evidence for them, and when the evidence we do have is telling another story. Yet, the philosophically rhizomic, non-binary, non-essentialist thinking associated with créolité can still be useful to us as a method of deconstruction and interpretation. Scholars have already, for example, insisted that we break down the perspective that enslavement and freedom were absolute states. Rather, as Jennifer Palmer and others have suggested, there are varying degrees and modes of servitude, from those working in the field to those working within households, from physical labor on plantations to the physical labor of sexual and reproductive servitude, from the liminal states of the runaway slave to those who were legally enslaved but lived as free. These were called people who were libres de fait, enslaved but living as free, just not legally manumitted. And then to individuals like Saint-Georges, who served in high-level positions in elite orchestras and theaters of princes and princesses. Likewise, a series of binaries must be discarded. As historian Éric Noël has indicated, we cannot speak of Saint-Georges' trajectory in terms of integration or exclusion. He benefited from his father's care and financial support, while the latter was alive at least, but he was excluded from an inheritance upon his father's death. He conducted one of the premier orchestras in Europe, but was blocked from taking on the leadership of a more official institution of the Royal Academy of Music. Relatedly, we cannot speak of elite French society, the individuals close to Saint-Georges or Saint-Georges himself, as racist, anti-racist, or colorblind. And here a binary is not even possible. These are multiple, three different things, and have degrees of potency in each. And of course, though he has been referred to as the Black Mozart, I do not like this, he was not black or white, strictly speaking. And he certainly should not be named and remembered based upon the cultural capital of another child prodigy who was a virtuosic composer and musician who he himself likely inspired. We need to fix these things. Yet we cannot dismiss Saint-Georges' blackness as a factor in his life, nor do we wish to in our redemptive project to celebrate him in Black diasporic history. Rather than speaking in terms of black and white, it is more fruitful to think about the word that I've been using, blackness. And rather than turning toward Caribbean critique, créolité, or unproductive binary conceptualizations, I think that adopting concepts from critical race theory and critical mixed race theory are valuable in illuminating a more legitimate view of Saint-Georges' racialization. Éric Noël and more recently art historian Anne Lafont have published brilliant studies of racial representations and associations with phenotype and skin color during the 18th century in France. These are very important points of orientation. In addition to images intended to depict the horrors of slavery, another iconography and practice of portraiture grew to be in vogue that featured black, brown, and racially mixed domestic servants, valets, and pages, either alone or with their white privileged mistresses and masters. One of the most visible and appalling cases was Louis XIV's mistress, Madame du Barry, who had acquired an enslaved servant from Bengal, christened Louis Benoit Zamor. Zamor was also referred to as black, although he was South Asian, and for a long time people thought that this was Zamor because of the confusion in the terminology about race. But this is not Zamor. That is Zamor. Zamor later indicated the ways in which du Barry had treated him as a mere toy and humiliated him, seemingly in perverse games with other members of her courtly entourage that were so dastardly that he deigned to mention them in his writings. In his seminal work of critical race theory entitled A Critique of Our Constitution is the Colorblind, Neil Gotanda posits the useful observation that per the dominant paradigm of social relations during this period, although not all Africans were slaves, virtually all slaves were not white. It was their racial otherness that came to justify the subordinated status of black people. In the assessment of Cheryl Harris, another pioneer of critical race theory, I quote, "The hyperexploitation of black labor was accomplished by treating black people themselves as objects of property. Race and property were thus conflated by establishing a form of property contingent on race. Only blacks were subjugated as slaves and treated as property," end quote. Blackness, enslaved labor, and property were thus encoded together And an additional layer of racialized disdain arose from Saint-Georges being born of miscegenation. Louis Chevalier de Jaucourt's article in Diderot and d'Alembert's famed Encyclopédie defining the mulatto or mulatto, which was a term, again, deployed by contemporaries when referring to Saint-Georges, relayed only prejudice. Jaucourt's lexicon conjures up social and personal delinquency, linking miscegenation with libertinage, disorder, scandal, and crime, and these are Jaucourt's words. Saint-Georges, as a brown-skinned son of a formerly enslaved black woman and white French father, was not spared this series of associations with blackness and with the mulatto, as period descriptions of him, as well as the racist insults that he suffered, both relay. His skin color and mixed heritage, however, was only a piece of the puzzle of his identity. Kimberlé Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality urges us to consider the interplay of race, gender, sexuality, and social class. However, we must add into this mix the social forces of family ties, at times honored and at times abandoned, as well as his own extraordinary talents and ambition. These are additions we must include when calculating intersectionality. If his racialization represented an obstacle to social and professional ascension, his father's money and Saint-Georges' merit placed him in the most elite circles of 18th century France. What is more, his gender augmented his advantages in the patriarchal society of his time, in the human and labor economy of chattel slavery, as well as the social order in metropolitan France. The black woman, and both words here are conjoined into one, indicating the imbrication of gender and race, could not aspire to the positions and relations that marked Saint-Georges' life. Jennifer Palmer's study of Marie and Charlotte Mondroux, the mixed-race daughters of white Saint-Dominguez planter Aimé Benjamin Fleuriot, who brought the entirety of his family, mixed-race children, as well as white legitimate children, with him to France, attest to this difference in outcome related to the nexus of gender and race, a place where Saint-Georges experienced privilege. These women were never accepted into French society, and they were disadvantaged by their father, even compared to their mixed-race brothers. Departing from critical race theory to examine 18th century sources, we can see that Saint-Georges indeed benefited from both power and privilege in accordance with the way that the encyclopédistes and other philosophers of the time wrote about these concepts. In Denis Diderot's analysis of modes of authority, authority issues forth from a superiority in rank, an empire from the art of controlling the weak. Power, contrastingly, comes from a hierarchical dynamic of force, from a hierarchical dynamic of force, but rather from relationship building, the attachment that people feel towards a person from interpersonal connections and networks. A star of courtly society, Saint-Georges possessed this type of power in spades. Similarly, definitions of privilege expounded upon in the encyclopedia reveal that Saint-Georges could have been seen to possess multiple forms of privilege. These include what Diderot referred to as the most legitimate of privileges, those that nature bestows on an individual, meaning talent, as well as social distinctions that one acquires by birth or by princely decree. On top of these more concrete forms of privilege, a longer article defining privilege in terms of government, economics, and politics raised the topic of social currency. In this, those who have the honor to serve in the king's household and who are close to the king's person, I quote, justly and decently, decently, I guess is the word, participate in some way in the dignity of their royal master, end quote. Viewed through all of these definitions, Saint-Georges can be seen to have been powerful and privileged, even if it was in a circumscribed way. In my work, I'm trying to discern whether any contemporaries who wrote about Saint-Georges believed his power or privilege inhered from his blackness. I am looking through the sources. This is an ongoing project, an ongoing book project, so you'll have to stay tuned for new developments in this work. So to conclude, I want to bring these thoughts to a convergence through the title of my talk today, Black Power, Race and Privilege in Early Modern France. I hope my remarks have elucidated the complex relationship between race, power, and privilege for individuals like Saint-Georges, and I hope to have convinced you that these concepts can be brought together in fruitful and perhaps unexpected ways. The notion of Black power, which I at once advance in using the expression and problematize symbolically by using the vertical bar between the words that you see, can lead us down further paths of inquiry as we consider the phenomenon and aftermath of chattel slavery. Historical uses of the idea of Black power in our own country can also offer ways of thinking about history in the longue durée and about other places, such as Paris during the epoch of Saint-Georges. In the 1850s, for example, Frederick Douglass used the expression Black power as a racialized synonym for enslaved power, by which the labor of Black bodies conferred political power and privilege upon plantation owners of the South. Yet this transfer of Black enslaved kinetic energy into political and social domination by an elite racialized as white extends far beyond the power of plantation owners. As the 1619 Project urges us to acknowledge, the modern economic and political might of great powers like the US and France is also a macro manifestation of Douglass's idea of Black power. That is to say, these nations are what they are, in part due to the enslaved labor that built them. The American Black Power movement in the mid-20th century can also serve as a lens for thinking about race, power, and privilege in the past, and for teaching us valuable lessons in the present. The American Black Power movement was in some ways amorphous, with ties to the civil rights movement that were productive but also strained, and with champions who were more or less in favor of violence and/or Black separatism. I do not evoke Black power today to promulgate this movement in its historical form, but rather to open up a thought experiment that uses some of the movement's central tenets as fruitful prisms for reflection. The Black Power movement advocated for racial pride, Black solidarity, Black values, and the creation of Black political, economic, and cultural institutions that could advance Black collective interests. None of this seems to have been thinkable during the pre-revolutionary era in France, at least given what we know at this point. And I hope that some students here at Eastern Illinois University will take up this research as well, because there is much that we still have to learn, and likely some surprising stories to be told. However, another foundational aim of the Black American power movement can perhaps be applied as we think about Saint-Georges and those like him in the 18th century. This aim is self-determination for people of color, the inalienable right to personal autonomy and agency in building one's life trajectory. According to Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton in their 1967 book, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, I quote, "Only Black people can convey the revolutionary idea, and it is a revolutionary idea, that Black people are able to do things themselves," end quote. Saint-Georges is an example of this type of self-determination. While he was no radical, perhaps we can view his actions as revolutionary nevertheless, as they represented to those of his era and to posterity both his own greatness and the general idea that all people can and should have the right to do, to fail, and to try again. And one final key learning from both Saint-Georges' life and the American Black Power movement is the importance of allyship. Saint-Georges' story and actions are his own. But this is also the story of powerful allies who acknowledged his merit, nourished and celebrated his talents, gave him opportunities and protection, and committed his extraordinary life to memory through their writings and artworks. So it was then, as it is now, and I leave you with this final lesson that I hope you will take to heart. We are all in this together. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to do some questions and answers, or there may be announcements.
No.
No
Well,
announcements?
actually, I will have some announcements, but I'll do that because the audience like these usually tend to have somebody way over there asks a question, so I have to walk a long distance. I've prepared some things to say during those long walks. But let's start. Questions?
Any questions or comments, thoughts?
Thank you very much for that wonderful talk. Just as you were speaking, I was thinking a lot about contemporary France and the yet again recent rise in Islamophobia, and I was wondering if any of your research has overlapped with the construction of race in terms of Arabic and Muslim populations, and if there's been anything kind of similar from what you've discovered in terms of those populations.
Thank you for that excellent question. And this is indeed a piece of the puzzle. There are some scholars like Madeleine Doby, who is at Columbia, who have worked on what's happening in terms of people from the Middle East and what essentially is a type of Orientalism happening during the 18th century, including in celebrated works of the Enlightenment like Montesquieu's Persian letters. So this is absolutely a central piece of that history of Islamophobia, the roots of this moment of Orientalism in France. And something that Madeleine Doby talks about that's very interesting is because there were very few enslaved people in France in the beginning of the 18th century, people didn't even know really how to imagine what enslaved people were like. And so they often represented them as sort of Middle Eastern, as sort of wearing Middle Eastern garb, as sort of, with the, which was also sort of invented. They didn't really know much about Middle Eastern garb either. So there's this interesting conflation between what enslaved African people in the Caribbean might be like, and then this imaginary about the Middle East. So it's a very fertile sort of line of inquiry. In my particular work, I haven't been looking at that other than sort of connecting to the research that Madeleine Doby and others have done. But I'm going to continue to think about it to see where are these places of convergence. Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Blair. Other questions or comments? Any thoughts on this? Anything you felt was surprising? Students, don't be afraid to speak up. If you found something interesting or surprising, you don't have to ask a question. You can just kind of say stuff that's going through your head.
I believe that the word privilege has taken on a certain resonance recently.
Yes.
And it tends to be used to be considered from a negative point of view. That the word white privilege has shown up quite a bit. And you're supposed to react. Obviously, privilege is bad. Would the Chevalier de Saint-Georges have reacted in that way to the word privilege?
Thank you for that question and for bringing up this really important subject. And of course, in 2019, making reference to using this word privilege when talking about race, I knew that in your minds and hoped that in your minds, this notion of white privilege would be floating around. So I'm thinking about exactly this and about this type of interpretation of privilege. And in fact, with the French Revolution, there's a lot of documentation about privilege and the psychology of privilege and the structures of it, mainly directed at the aristocracy, at the French nobility of the time, which were a tiny minority of the French population, but who didn't pay taxes, many of whom lived in a lap of luxury while the whole rest of the country was working and paying heavy taxes for all of these wars that took place during the 18th century. So there is, the way that we think of privilege and about white privilege, this was an idea, I would say, or a phenomenon that was coalescing during the 18th century. And then the psychology of privilege and the ignorance of privilege is something that revolutionaries like Sieyès talk about directly. So as part of my research, I want to dig into this and really see if there are connections, if there is a genealogy toward what we think of as white privilege, beginning at this time. I think that Saint-Georges, as one of these intermediary figures who's not a revolution, he's not Toussaint Louverture, and at the same time, his roots, who he is, his color are realities, everyday realities for him. And so, I think that his relationship to privilege, which I've started to sort of look at here, is complicated. He benefits from it. He wants that. He has probably levels of ignorance with regard to that same blindness of privilege. And so as this research continues, I really want to be able to flesh out how this occurs. White privilege now, I think that instead of saying that white privilege is simply bad, I would say that it exists. And that the first step is just to say that, and is for each individual to think about what privileges you have. You may benefit from white privilege. You may benefit from different types of privilege. I benefit from certain privileges because of the places I went to school. Certain doors are open for me that may not be otherwise toward women of color. So things happen because of these different privileges. So I think that we need to think about that in multiple ways. And that's the first step to it no longer really being a blind privilege. It's something that we acknowledge, and then we can become allies and we can become agents to try to break down this system that we have inherited. We didn't make this system that we live in, a system that many call a system of white supremacy. But it's not just that, it's multiple forms of systemic discrimination. We're still on the spectrum for women, for gender, for sexuality. All of these different aspects of intersectionality are part of a story of hierarchy and subjugation. And so the more we can shine light onto our privilege and act as allies in these different areas, the more we'll be able to break down a system that we didn't choose, that we inherited, but that I think it is our responsibility to try to change. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Here's
Stream of
another question
consciousness?
over here.
David.
Really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
And what you were just saying about privilege, I found really interesting also. But I guess I want to raise a question about the problem of privilege as an analytical category.
Yes.
That it seems to be fairly binary. Privilege is something you have or you don't have. And I wonder if, as an analytical category, if a Bourdieusian language of capital would be more useful. First of all, because there are so many different forms of capital, and one doesn't think of capital as binary. You have different aspects or different amounts of it.
Thank you very much for that. I definitely, and I think I may have mentioned social capital without saying Bourdieu in the talk, but yes, I think you're right that this is a very apt way and tool for talking about what's happening here. I think also, though, and I may have done an insufficient job of talking about it here, and it's something that I'll be dedicating myself to as I continue this research, is to thinking about privilege in non-binary ways, is to show, just like the question of slavery, the question of servitude, that there is a kind of scale. And especially if we consider privilege as a type of psychology, which is how people at the time end up talking about it, at least during the French Revolution, and likely in other documents that I haven't yet discovered or looked at. So I want to first test privilege to see if it has that elasticity, and my hunch is that it does. But that if it doesn't, it will be a heuristic or an analytical tool that I'll need to move away from. Although I will still be talking about it since it features prominently in what's happening here. But thank you very much for that, and I do agree that the notion of capital is very elastic and useful in that sense. Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, good. I get to make an announcement while I'm walking over here. Don't forget to come to the Secret Garden musical here at Doudna. That's going to be playing from Thursday to Sunday. It's a Secret Garden musical.
I second that notion. I support the theater department.
Awesome.
So my question is, in your opinion, what is the validity of the systemic racism in our penal/legal systems, and how can we counter this?
Thank you. That's a huge question, and I mean, to my mind, we have a major problem. We have a major problem, just like Cheryl Harris talks about the way that race and property became imbricated, that these concepts came together. Over time, as the question of race and property couldn't be thought of in the same ways, I don't think most people look at a person of color would look at someone like me or another person of color and say, ha ha, property. That's gone out of our cultural language, but instead, what has happened is that we think of criminality. And that is, I think, a story of historical transformation in vocabulary, but not in the sort of framework of race and another negative aspect of human civilization being juxtaposed onto one another. You know, what I think, in addition to penal reform, I mean, really practical things have to be happening in our criminal justice system. They have to be happening in terms of our policing practices and education and policies. But I also think that it has to happen on a personal level, that we have to, if we're part of the change, and I think we have to be, each of us, part of the change. You may go and be an activist and you may learn about these matters, you may become a lawyer and you can work in our criminal justice system, and we need that service. But you can also be somebody who walks down the street and says, geez, I noticed that I just kind of flinched or made an assumption when I saw a person of a certain identity walking behind me. You know, this is part of the self-dialogue that we need to be frank about, and that then we can dismantle. So I think that there is work with ourselves that needs to happen, and that can also be part of our discussions and of education. That happens in families, it happens at home, it happens in our classrooms. It can happen when you're hanging around with friends at a party, right? And part of what I've seen as I've looked at the literature on racism and on combating it here and on combating discrimination is actually being willing to sort of call something out when it happens. And it's really hard to do that. It's hard to call yourself out, and it's hard to call someone else out, especially if it's a friend or somebody you care about, or a teacher, somebody who is in a power role above you and who's going to be like giving you a grade in a class or something. These are really hard moments to articulate that something has gone wrong. But we as a culture, and at least inside our universities, can start to make this movement, to make our classrooms and our experiences on campus, to make these safe places to talk about it and to say, you know, what, Professor Pichichero, I know that you said that we don't use the term mulatto anymore and it's insulting, and you explained it, but you still used it a few times in your presentation, and I really didn't like that. And I feel insulted by that as a racially mixed person. Would you consider using different terminology? Legit, you know? You have to be able to say these things, and we have to be okay with the fact that we will make mistakes. I make mistakes, all of us make mistakes, all of us have issues in these areas. So it's okay, it's like a piece of humble pie to say, yeah, you know, I made a mistake, and to say I'm sorry. And I don't know how I can make it up to you, but I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better next time. My hope and the sort of best practices that I read about have to do with this, the acknowledgement of one's own actions, of one's own thoughts, and an attempt to really rectify. Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Pichichero, thank you so much for talking about such timely topics that we at Eastern need to hear. I understand you're a professor of French. Could you please explain to us, I'm a professor of Spanish, how your study of French language and Francophone culture has led you to be able to address these timely, super important issues?
Thank you so much. Yeah, as I indicated, a lot of these problems are sort of, and these structural characteristics of societies and cultures, some of them are shared among different countries, but they also have their own particularities that need to be examined. As Professor Park mentioned, when I was young, when I was in college, I started a career as an opera singer, and that career sent me to France. And it was there that I lived myself some of the racism that occurs there. Interestingly, I was not racialized as somebody of black and white heritage, which is what I am. I was racialized as a Muslim woman. And so those were the types of insults that I got, and those were the grounds on which, for example, I was excluded from entering into clubs in provincial towns. Not that I was trying to go in clubs and drink and, no, professors don't do that when they're young. So I experienced the culture of race in my time abroad, and it's something that fascinated me. I said, how, people, the way that I walk down the street in America is different than the way that I walk down the street in France, and the way that people look at me. And it really drove me to want to learn the language, to learn French, to learn more about the history, and to become a part and an interlocutor in that history. And right now on the very important listserv of French historians, it's called H France, and it has been directed by your own David Camerling for many years. Dr. Camerling is really a backbone of French history worldwide. This listserv has more than 3,500 members, and it not only publishes book reviews and information about conferences and jobs, but it also creates its own publications. And I am part of one right now, an H France Salon, talking about race and racism, and how we talk about it and study it in America, and then how we talk about it and study it in France. And so it has scholars from both sides of the Atlantic coming together to deliberate on these issues that are so important in both of these countries. And so, I think it's very important as teachers in foreign language departments, and for me in the case of France, many people's first thought about France is more like baguettes and berets, and not so much about a history of slavery and race, but this is also French history. And so what I try to do is bring that into my teaching. I teach courses about race in French and Francophone cinema. My class that I teach, an advanced seminar in my study abroad program in Paris, is called Colonial Metropolis. And this is named after a book by the historian and literary scholar Jennifer Boitin, who is at Penn State. Fantastic book. And the concept that, okay, there's the baguettes and beret version of France, and people love that, and you can eat all those baguettes and if you buy yourself a beret. But we also should talk about the history of Paris as a place of many different people, a place of many cultures, of many languages. And that is what Paris is now. But many people don't necessarily introduce their students to those facets of the city. So we went and visited places where, for example, Black Americans during the Harlem Renaissance, those who came to France to find an escape from the racial pressures and from segregation in the United States, they sat in cafes, they created a culture, they were able to write. And so actually, this is not only a part of American history, but also a part of French history, was the arrival of these people and how they changed the art scene and the philosophical and academic scene in Paris. So I think it's, for those who are interested in Spanish history, the ties to slavery are immense. And the question of racialization, there's so much to look at. So when you come into the question of studying foreign languages, you should know that you can go in many different directions with this. Yeah. Thank you.
Don't forget about the Vienna Boys Choir on Thursday.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
This is a comment actually about
Please.
the times we live in.
Yeah.
Your own university, George Mason University, named after a famous slave owner.
Yes.
He had so much monopoly power, in fact, monopoly over slaves. He didn't agree to the freeing of slaves when the discussion came up because it would reduce his profit,
Right.
eliminates his profit.
Yeah.
But here you are, a person of your stature, talking about slavery and lecturing about it. What do you think George Mason would feel today, given the times we live in, and what would you think his take would be?
Thank you so much for this. You know, it's something on a bad day that drives me crazy. To say, gosh, you know, I am working, you know, I don't know my own, the story of my own heritage. The black part of my family, a lot of that genealogy is still unknown. There's a strong likelihood that I'm a descendant of an enslaved person in this country. And so working at George Mason University, you know, I was on a bad day, I'm like, God, you know, of all the places. But as you know, other universities like Georgetown University participated in the slave trade. They're now trying to figure out ways of making reparations. But you know, for George Mason, the university and the professors there who ask these questions have been taking actions, mainly also in their scholarship. So we have a research group that looks at the enslaved children of George Mason, that looks at the enslaved people who inhabited those lands. And so there's a real sense of dedication to telling the truth and to doing that with George Mason as we do with our founding fathers. It wasn't, you know, liberty and justice for all. It simply wasn't. And so we need to talk this way now and to teach that. I found out recently, actually, that George Washington, who also was a slave owner, that they had some enslaved servants who traveled with them, just like some of these people I was talking about in the French context who went from the colonies to France and back. So they would travel to the north where people could be considered free after a certain amount of time. The Washingtons, but they were sure to send that enslaved person back or to come back themselves before that person could claim freedom. So there was an actual calculation on the part of the Washingtons to make sure that their enslaved people remained enslaved. And so, you know, the more we dig into this history, the more the people who are memorialized in the city in which I live, Washington, D.C., we see the dubious parts of their behavior, things that we disapprove of. Interestingly, with George Mason, there's a monument to him. It's a smaller one on the sort of, if you picture where the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial is, and if you haven't seen it, I suggest you go. It's a beautiful monument. It's an interesting one that's caused some controversy, so worth it to go see. It's sort of across from that is a little George Mason one, where he talks about the ills of slavery, where he talks about how it is morally degrading for enslaved people, of course, but also for slave owners. So there's this funny paradox of his awareness, and his awareness is what we memorialize. We do not have also on that monument a part that says, and this is how many enslaved people he purchased and kept enslaved. So a part of me would like to think that George Mason would be happy that I'm here making this talk, that I'm talking about these things, that he knew that slavery was morally wrong, and that he didn't have, he wasn't willing to make the next step to turn that, to sacrifice the financial solvency of his family to do the right thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Perhaps one last question, if there is one. There is not. There's a reception coming up right away. I'll tell you that in a second, but I really think we should give Christy Pichichero one last.
Thank you.
Great job. Thanks very much, Christy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming on this terrible weather day. And reach out to me. You can find me if you can spell my name. That's the rub. You got to spell my name. So take a picture of the poster, and students, fellow faculty, administrators, reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you, to help, to think about these things.